I'm up on the hillside, about half an hour's walk from Dharma. I came up here last night to sleep out in my hammock and enjoy the sunrise this morning. I'm not sure if this is technically a breach of lockdown or just my one piece of exercise for the day, but it's pretty cool nonetheless. So I'm also going to talk a bit about Vedana. So Vedana, often translated as feeling, sometimes translated as feeling tone. So in English, feeling is one of those words that has quite a broad spectrum of meaning, whereas Vedana is quite specific. It's the associated pleasant or unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant, experience that arises with some sort of either sense contact or some sort of experience. So touch, or as we were saying before, touch or smell or taste, or of course our inner experiences, what we would call our emotional experiences, also have associated Vedana. In contact with things that are pleasant, we often feel attracted to them. In contact with things that we experience as unpleasant, we often feel like we want to withdraw from them. Aversion. And many things in our experience are neither pleasant nor unpleasant. They're just sort of neutral. And we tend to ignore those. So of course the Vedana is not so much quality, well, it's not a quality of the object, it's an experience we have in association with our sense experience, which is why I was expanding the concept of rupa away from the simple material form into our experience of our world. And Vedana, although simply classified as pleasant, painful or neutral, is very important, because it's whether we find something pleasant or painful or simply are indifferent towards it is a very strong motivator as to how we respond. And while this is true of the material world, it's also true of our inner world, our emotional lives. The material world, of course, is fascinating because actually when you look at it, it's incredibly rich. I'll give you a little close-up of this rock here in a moment. And the neutral elements of Vedana, often when we look more carefully, we find that things are not as neutral as we think. And this is one of the great joys, the great invigorating elements of mindfulness, is that by paying attention to the world, we start to notice it in more detail. And usually what happens when you notice things in more detail is they actually become more interesting, more pleasurable. Whereas if you allow a pervasive neutrality to take a hold of your mind, as it were, well, the world becomes boring because we don't pay very much attention to it. And quite often then, of course, what happens is we create more interesting things in our minds. So yeah. Neutral Vedana. Neutral Vedana is often said to be the basis of ignorance. We simply ignore things, we don't pay attention. But just to come back to this idea that Vedana, the pleasant or unpleasant experience that is associated with our sense experience or our inner experience, motivates us. This is a very important area for us to be aware of. If we can become more aware of Vedana, if we can become more sensitive to Vedana, it becomes easier for us to choose how to respond and react in certain situations. So the teaching doesn't suggest that we shouldn't experience Vedana. It's kind of a given that we're going to experience some things as pleasant or some things as unpleasant. That's kind of a given. It's as a vipaka, karma vipaka. It arises on the basis of the past, as it were. It's there. What is interesting is how we choose to respond. Do we simply choose to jump straight to grasping after those things that we find pleasurable and pushing away those things that we find unpleasant? It's this grasping after and pushing away that starts to construct and form our world and construct and form our sense of ourselves within our world. So Vedana becomes something that we can become more sensitive to, become more aware of and alive to, and start to choose more carefully how to respond. When something makes us feel angry, that's an emotion, and it's often a painful emotion that we have a strong desire to do something about. So we can just hold back, feel the fact that that's painful, and make a choice as to what a creative or constructive response might be. The same with pleasurable feelings. Falling in love is deeply pleasurable. It's not always wise just to run off after that experience. More object-associated Vedana, we might like cake. Does that mean we just eat lots of it until we feel sick? Sometimes that is what happens, but it's not always the best way of responding. So you've got a sort of use of Vedana to create a more intelligent and sensitive response to our world. And by training in becoming aware of Vedana, becoming more sensitive to Vedana, we also start to notice how that associated experience of craving and aversion is part of what forms our fixed sense of self, starts to shore us up in a certain kind of a way. So noticing Vedana, noticing its more ephemeral and associative qualities, and starting to sort of ask ourselves, well, what is this? What is this experience? It's not sort of substantially me. It's not the object. It's a sort of something that arises in association with the object, but it's the way Vedana moves into motivation, which we'll talk about later, of course, is part of the way in which we form our sense of self. I'm slightly distracted this morning by the pleasurable experience of being up here on the hillside about an hour after dawn, and yet at the same time, actually my hands are quite cold, and I have a feeling it could be time for a cup of coffee. So I'll go and get my little camp stove started and do that. So Vedana often acts like a sort of, almost like a filtering system, unconsciously influencing where our attention is drawn, or how our moods are, or influencing our volition. By associating an experience of pleasant or painful, or neither pleasant nor painful, with a whole range of experiences that arise in our mind. And of course, talking about mind, as we said when we were talking about Rupa, Rupa isn't just the materiality of the world, it's our experience of that materiality. So it's also an experience of mind. So, Vedana isn't a fixed quality of objects or a fixed quality of us. If we watch it, we'll notice that as well as being conditioning, it's also ephemeral. We can just pay attention to Vedana, trying to not instantly react to it, and watch both its conditioning nature on our minds, on our sense of ourselves, and start to see how ephemeral it is, how transient and insubstantial the Vedana experience actually is. And in this way, a kind of loosening arises simply by watching, a kind of freedom. I won't say awakening, but just a sort of a more free relationship with our experience.